Mainstream media manipulation. We talked about it a lot here on this channel about how many of the things in the mainstream media, either through omission or distortion or sometimes outright fabrication, spread certain things on the airwaves or in print that are just not true. And just on the surface of it, that's a bad thing because it's just we don't want the lies being told us. That's what's supposed to be. The fourth estate, in media, free media, is supposed to keep the government, safe, and it's supposed to keep us safe from the government, etc. Now then, that's fallen apart. But I'm going to show you today a very specific instance of just how that media is manipulated and what potential consequence that it could have and what it almost had in the past as well. And we have back with the show today, Professor Ted Postol, Professor of Science, Technology, and National Security at the MIT. We've had him on several times before, and he's always given us exceptional insight into things that have been going on. We're also going to talk about some of those things later as well. But today, Ted Postol himself was at the center of some controversy in the United States. First of all, in the Washington Post, in relations to Tulsi Gabbard's nomination to be Director of National Intelligence, and then subsequently as part of the hearing that happened. So we're going to get to that in just a second. But Ted, first of all, I just kind of want your welcome to the show. But in this case, it's a little different here. Kind of, what are your thoughts when you heard your name bandied about in the Washington Post?
Well, it was not a surprise because I spent, I think, well over a week and a half talking to this journalist, Isaac Stanley Becker, Stanley-Becker, and he was pretty, initially I thought he was serious, but then as it went on in our discussions, it became clear that he was writing what I would call a hit piece. I sometimes refer to these as drive-by shootings. And it also became clear that this entire exercise came from the top management of the Washington Post. Now, let me be explicit on this because it's in my slides, which we won't have a chance to show, but are available to any of your your audience who just drop me a note and ask for all the slides, because there's a tremendous number of slides we obviously won't have any time to look at. But this piece, this article, this fraudulent article, I should say, and a fraud is a kind way of describing it, ran in the center of the front page above the fold in the paper. That only happens with the top leadership of the paper being involved. There's no question that this went right up to the top leadership and the editors, among the editors, and maybe even the owners or the managing editors. The record of my discussions with him, which I have mostly in the form of emails, will indicate to anybody who looks at it that he was not, the journalist was not interested in any of the content of any of the issues of why Tulsi Gabbard had concerns. He was
sorry, let me just educate our folks who may not be aware, and we're going to get to that in just a second.
Yeah, sure.
The specific allegations are that Tulsi Gabbard had apparently listened to you back in, I think it was 2013, about some alleged chemical strikes by the Assad regime against his own people, which you were questioning based on some evidence that you had. And so at this hearing, they're saying, and you're going to see this for yourself, they're saying, how could you listen to this guy, Ted Postol, instead of the intelligence community? In fact, this is a great point to just pause here. Here's how what happened in the Washington Post. This is how it translated into actions.
Yeah, but we should see that clip. But let me first make a comment here.
Okay.
I was an advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations between 1982 and 1984. I was a science and policy advisor to the chief. In one episode, there were a number of very important episodes with the chief, but in one episode, I discovered a fundamental vulnerability in a basic mode for the Peacekeeper missile that would have invited it's being attacked and destroyed. It was so fundamental a vulnerability. The entire system missed that vulnerability. So there's a record inside the Pentagon of me alerting the chief of naval operations to this vulnerability, him sending my analysis out to the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Defense Intelligence Agency verified that my analysis was correct. That is to say, I was not active. It did not come from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was the one who missed it. The intelligence community did not know about this did not understand this vulnerability till I discovered it and pointed it out to the chief. And if you look in the newspaper from that period, you will find that even though President Reagan chose that system initially for the deployment scheme for the Peacekeeper missile, 3 of the 5 Joint Chiefs voted against that deployment. That's a unique event in history where the Joint Chiefs did not support the president on a decision he made. That was Ted Postol, the supposed guy who doesn't know what he's talking about intelligence.
Yeah,
so
we
I just
already
want to make that point.
Yeah, and plus we can add to that. We've also had you on our show in the past about how you also figured out what the vulnerability on the Russian side was against notification or identification of incoming missiles, which could pose a big problem for getting us into a nuclear war. People can go back and look at that. But
which I warned the intelligence community about because they did not know about it.
Right. Yeah, that's my point here. Your cred at the highest levels of the United States are very, very high. So in 2013, when Tulsi Gabbard was asking your opinion, it came for a specific reason. And yet, here's how that was depicted on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
You explain to me then why you doubted the intelligence community's conclusions in these 2 cases, Duma and Kanche-Kun, but not the others. And please be specific.
These 2 cases were being looked at as to be used as a pretext for major military movement. And my fear was a repeat of the deployment of another 500,000 soldiers like we saw in Iraq towards what was the Obama administration's goal, which was regime change in Syria. The question specifically that I raised around these 2 came about because there were 2 reasons. One, that assessment was made with high confidence and low information. The information that they had came from those on the ground in an al-Qaeda controlled area and therefore were al-Qaeda linked sources. And there was conflicting information that came from the UN's Office on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Inspectors, as well as an MIT professor, Ted Postol,
So I
who
want to talk
looked at
about him
these
for a
extensively.
second. So did you look into his credentials, yes or no?
Yes.
And were you aware of his appearances on Russian Today, which is used by the Russians to disseminate government-approved messages?
Gary, can you pause right there?
Were you aware
So we're going to finish this in just a second, but I wanted to jump in right here. So you see there's Senator Kelly saying not any of the qualifications that you just mentioned, which were exceptional, but he says that the qualification he wants to focus on is that apparently at one point you went on RT television. So
yeah,
that
and you
right
know,
there
another transgression I should point out that I probably should apologize to the public for is I talked to the Washington Post. I mean, that seems to be, in my, I do talk to Russian news sources when they ask me. And I have never found them to manipulate any of the things that I stated in those in those interviews. Never. That's not the case with the Western.
And of course, he doesn't care. No, there's people. They just want guilt by association. If it came from Russia, we all know everything Russia is evil and bad.
Absolutely.
So that means you're evil and bad, and we shouldn't listen to anything you say.
Well,
but that just shows you the paucity of what they're trying to do here, because they're trying character assassination. They didn't go into your actual qualifications on the subject matter. So I just wanted to highlight that.
It's a very disappointing display by Senator Kelly. This guy was a former astronaut, so
right.
he has some technical capacity to make judgments about content.
Yeah, in the
And
event that he actually looked at your arguments there, which
I mean,
seems like
he
didn't.
could have contacted me. I would have been pleased to brief him. And in fact, I probably will write him a letter and ask him if he wants me to brief him. I predict he won't follow
All right.
through.
I think that we can take that one to the bank.
But I want it on record that I'm going to be asking him, and I want it on record whether or not he agrees to have a meeting and talk about this.
Well, we'll be interested to see how that transpires.
We'll see. We'll see.
But let's, Gary, if we can run back to that video and continue on here. Here's what he said next.
Postol relied on a chemistry student with a record of defending the Assad regime.
At that time, I was not. I have been
Sorry,
made aware
pause
since.
again there, Gary. So, first it was your guilt because you had association with anything that came out of Russia. Now then, we're to question everything you said because somebody that you used on your staff to help do some of this information apparently had some pro-Assad leanings or so. What do you say to that?
Well, it's a very interesting story there, too. This is an allegation made by a bunch of internet trolls who had no idea what they were talking about. And they were claiming I won't go into the detail because it'll just spin people's head. They were claiming that a certain material called hexamine was a critical component in the nerve agent production used by the Syrian government. And I had a guess made on data I looked at for this hexamine that it would not dissolve in the alcohol that it needed to be dissolved into, that it was insoluble. And I couldn't find any chemistry reference. And this woman looked like she really knew some chemistry. In fact, she did. And I asked her if she could provide me, if she could go through, because she's a chemist and goes through and has access to all the chemistry journals, if she could provide me with a refereed scientific article that provides the solubility of hexamine. And she provided me with that. That's all she did. And she actually provided me with an article that showed that the claims being made by other people that were cited in this Washington Post article, like this woman Rofer, were false. Because you can't dissolve something that's insoluble in an alcohol and use it to produce chemicals. To produce nerve agent. So this was just outrageous.
Right. So without any of that context, he just makes it sound like because this person was allegedly a pro-Assad, or at least had sympathies in that direction, you should discount everything that came out scientifically. Obviously, he's not going to go into those details because it would be self-evident that that's absurd what he was saying on the surface. But you see the continuing pattern, trying to soil what you said by talking about some of these extraneous things, not looking at any of the substance of the actual intelligence you provided.
Well, it is a very, very disappointing behavior on the part of a senator who was also an astronaut, because unlike many of the other people on the intelligence panel, he does have a substantial experience working with engineering technologies. And he not only should have known better, he should have contacted me if he really thought there was an issue. He had time to do it.
If he wanted to. Clearly, he doesn't want to, because your work speaks for itself, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit subsequently. Yes. So let's get back to the hearing.
Do you consider this person or these two individuals now, do you consider them a better source for the chemistry of sarin gas than the U.S. intelligence community?
I assess that at the time, the information, I don't know the second person you're referring to, but MIT Professor Ted Postol and the inspectors of the OPCW provided some credible questions that deserved examination.
Okay, thank you. Did you attempt to weigh Postol's claims against the significant evidence and assessments already conducted by the IC?
Yes, I did.
Pause, please. So that's one thing I really wanted to ask you about. He says that over this substantial evidence provided by the IC, that's intelligence community, that said that all of the claims were true, that they had used sarin gas. Are you aware of whatever they provided that said that it was true?
Let me say there is very substantial evidence that was presented, all of which pointed in the opposite direction. So that's what I would say. I mean, we'll obviously have a limited time in our discussion here, but I'll point out some of it later. I mean, anybody who looks at this stuff would just shake their head. Let me give you an example. Why didn't the intelligence community correct the claim made by the White House, which presumably was connected to the intelligence community, that a missile that carried sarin and that fell in Zamalka, causing death and injury to a large number of people, came from Syrian government areas, Syrian government controlled areas, at a range of 10 kilometers, when the range of the missile was actually 2 kilometers. This defies common sense. Why did the intelligence community allow that false statement to be published from the White House? I mean, if you can't measure distance and understand that a 2-kilometer range missile cannot travel 10 kilometers, what can you understand?
Right. And I want to shift gears now and get into some of the details of your report that you put together here, especially in regards to what the Washington Post said and what happened with all that. But I wanted to give the folks here just a real quick stage setter. In 2013, the Bashar al-Assad regime was in the midst of a civil war. There had been a whole bunch of rebel groups that had been allied against him, many of which we also had on our terror watch list, et cetera, some of which we funded, and they were battling Assad. Well, this started in 2011. He had finally started to gain the upper hand militarily and was starting to really close down some of the areas and drive the rebels out of certain areas. So he was on the military ascendancy and certainly had no need to use chemical weapons because all it would do is bring external pressure on him, and it would provide no battlefield wins, and he didn't need that. So that was the first thing that I thought, even without knowing any evidence, that it would seem interesting that the people who would benefit the most from an American adventurism are the ones who claim that's exactly what happened. But we'll get to that in a second. In 2013, when this happened, there was, because of some of this stuff by the intelligence community, there was huge pressure on the Obama administration to basically, if not go to war against Syria, to certainly hit them with a big, heavy strike. And this went to the Congress. I remember I actually was briefing some congressmen during this time, arguing against it without even knowing the evidence that you had at the time. But it was something that could have gotten us drawn into a regional war. Now, with that context, please tell us what you'd found out at the time.
Well, first, let me say it was almost the Gulf of Tonkin incident all over again, because we were talking about at least massive strikes on the Syrian government. At that particular time, I might point out that the Syrian government was not doing. They were just on the edge of being defeated by the rebels, and had we attacked its military, its own military, they may have then lost Damascus to the rebels. Now, of course, Damascus is in the hand of the rebels, and we will see what happens in Syria. I hope I'm wrong, but my guess is Syria is going to look a lot like Libya these days. It's going to look like it's going to descend into nothing but tribes and murders, and it already is beginning to look that way. But the issue was that let me just show you. Gary, could you jump to slide 23? Sorry to do this to you. We'll jump back to slide 12 after that. All right, slide 23 shows you a map that was published by the White House. So I just want to be clear. This was a White House map on
the Obama White House.
What?
The Obama White House.
The Obama White House.
Okay.
Absolutely correct. Good. You keep me in line. This area on the left that's slightly pinkish is the Syrian government controlled areas. the area on the right, which is grayish and it has little dots and labels on it, are areas where the White House and presumably the intelligence community, since James Clapper, we know, was involved in the oversight for this report, claims munitions, chemical munitions fell. In the upper labeled block, you'll see Zamalka, and Zamalka is actually where the munitions fell. So if we go to the slide 24, I have a blow up there of the Zamalka area. All those other points that were shown in this false and misleading intelligence report, there was no evidence of any kind of chemical falling in those areas. Just no reports thereafter, no information. The little yellow dots that you see were verified locations of chemical munitions impacts. We had a group, we went out, Michael Cobbs, a German analyst who's very capable, actually helped a lot with this and found all these locations. And so we know where those chemical rockets fell. Notice that they all fell in a relatively localized area, and the slightly distorted circular area around that area shows you the maximum possible range from which these chemical munitions could have been launched against Zamalka. So if we go back, notice to the left, you can see the pinkish area, quite a distance away, which would be the Syrian government-controlled areas. If we go to the next slide, it's 25, we can see that Zamalka area that I had outlined, and you can see it's a good distance away from the Syrian government-controlled areas. How did this happen? How do you make a mistake like this and claim that you know anything about what you're talking about? It's amazing. I mean, it's extraordinary. And let me also point out, if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about the testimony that John Kerry made to the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. I mean,
and Ted, just to make sure I'm looking at this map correctly here, it appears that if that yellow circle is the maximum range of the weapons that were claimed to have been used, or that were validated to have been used, that's the maximum range they could have been fired from. And then that pink area there looks to be another 2 or so kilometers further than that. Is that accurate?
The forward edge of the pink area, but in fact, the distance was much larger. Let's go to slide 12. Sorry to jump back there. Slide 12 is a repeat New York Times. I just want to make sure that all the usual suspects get their opportunity to be exposed. This front page article, I attempted to inform the author, J.J. Chivers, Chivers, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Maybe that tells us a little bit about the Pulitzer Prize these days.
Yeah.
In this map here, this shows what the New York Times decided were the ranges at which the munitions flew toward Zamalka. If we go to the next slide, number 13, here is Human Rights Watch, another bulwark of truth in the community. They published their own map, and they claim around nearly a 10-kilometer range for this munition. Now, if we go to slide 14, we see a diagram. This is from the New York Times on September 5. So what I showed you in the earlier slide, I think was September 15 or September 17, I forget which, the front page article. On September 5, the New York Times published an article about the work that a colleague of mine, Richard Lloyd, and I did, where we identified the shape and characteristics of this missile. Nobody knew anything about it at this time. The UN had not even published its report, where it replicated exactly what we found to fractions of a centimeter. Okay, so we had done this independently just from looking at videos and figuring out what we were actually looking at. If you go to slide 18, this gives you an example of how we determined what this missile really looked like, because we saw the missile on the ground, and we could see that there were all these debris around the impact point. This was because there was a barrel on the front of the missile that contained 50 liters of sarin, and when the missile hit the ground, it shattered. It just broke up and released the sarin. Now,
Ted, this image here, was this something that was released by the New York Times, mainstream media? Where did it come from?
I don't recall. It came from it was all over the place. We were, okay. This was like in videos, photographs, all over the place.
Got it.
So notice in this particular slide, I've highlighted at the crater in the Khan Sheikhoun attack. You notice that in the lower section. This is not Khan Sheikhoun. This is Zamalka. But there's no debris of this kind at Khan Sheikhoun around the crater, which was from the explosion of a rocket warhead, an explosive rocket warhead. If that rocket were carrying sarin, you would have seen debris of this kind around the crater. No debris of any kind. Even a neophyte would understand that this crater could not have been produced as claimed by a chemical munition. Now, just to go on a little bit further about this issue, we also, if you go back to slide 15 now, we constructed a comprehensive model of this missile, and we determined that the rocket motor that propelled this barrel of 50 liters of sarin was constructed from a barrel that had a cylindrical hole in the center of it, and the rocket was basically the rocket motor was basically shoved up into it, and it was a standard artillery rocket. I want to be underscored. This is a standard artillery. So this is a high technology rocket propulsion motor. High fuel loading, very efficient fuel measured, a very high what's called specific impulse. That was taken and shoved into a barrel. If we go to slide 20, we can see the barrel. This is the barrel. You can see there was a metal sleeve in the middle of the barrel. The outer part of the barrel, which was covered with some kind of shell so that you could fill the barrel with 50 liters of sarin, created the drum. You can see that the sleeve inside the barrel was the place where you could shove the rocket motor into it. If we go back one slide to slide 19, you can see that there's a very sophisticated looking rocket motor casing being shoved into the back end of this barrel. Why is it me finding this? What is the intelligence community doing?
And so what does this tell you? What when you see this stuff, what does that tell you?
This was an indigenously constructed, incidentally, the so-called critics who Kelly quoted, all said this couldn't be done. That's because none of them knows how to use a lathe or you know, when I was a student, I constructed experimental systems. I actually was in a machine shop a good part of my time building things. This is stuff that you can build with a just a non-specialized machine shop, as long as you have the components that you can scavenger from the sophisticated rocket motors. This is all indigenously put together missile.
So does that tell you that it may have been not the state actor of Syria, but just other people who had some technical capacity to alter a standard artillery rocket to I guess to aftermarket put that barrel on there? Is that accurate?
It's clearly and unambiguously shows that a organization or group with very limited technology available to them, but access to things like sophisticated artillery rockets, which can be bought, off the street, could put this together. You don't have to be the Syrian government at all. So all these arguments that these people were making, that somehow it had to be the Syrian government, nobody had this. This is like saying that, these improvised munitions, which did such terrible harm to so many of our people, can't be built because they use a cell phone as a detonator device that allows them. Well, a cell phone is a very sophisticated device, but you can buy that, and all you have to do is to know how to do a simple modification so that instead of ringing a chime, it sets off a detonator.
So was there anything beyond the range of the weapon, this weapon, because you can now see and you can determine precisely how far it can be launched. Was there anything else that led you to believe it was not the Syrian government, but it may have been other actors?
The only thing that you could potentially be concerned would not be available to them is the critical chemical components to mix sarin. But we know that they had sarin because we know from news reports that they were caught.
You said they had sarin. Who was they?
The rebels.
Okay.
We know the rebels had sarin. We know that the UN was warned that the rebels had sarin. We know that Cy Hirsch, I guess another individual who these people would argue knows nothing and has no accomplishments, that he reported that, in fact, that the al-Nusra had access to substantial amounts of sarin from his internal intelligence people, who were serious people in the intelligence community, but obviously not people that were used by Mr. Clapper and Mr. Brennan, who were trying to shape public understanding and perhaps the president's understanding of what was actually happening. We know all this. And at the same time, since we're talking of accusations made by Senator Kelly and others on the Intelligence Committee, what does the Intelligence Committee do if it doesn't know these facts?
Yeah.
What kind of oversight are these people engaged in? So why didn't they call me up? They knew who I'm very well known.
Oh, yeah, he used your name. He for sure knew who you were. But tell me if my summary understanding of this is correct. What you had said at the time was that evidence suggests that this was not fired by the Syrian government unless they secretly snuck several miles behind the line, fired, and then moved back or so, but that the evidence showed that it could have been done by any number of people, that there was motivation by the rebels, and that the rebels we knew had these kinds of components. But you couldn't conclusively say for sure who did it. You just said that this is what the evidence shows. Is that accurate?
The evidence provided by the White House indicates this. The White House didn't assert that the Syrian, they said Syrian government controlled areas. The White House said this.
So then with that very scientific background and that fact stuff that you said at the time, when now then the intelligence community is grilling Tulsi Gabbard to try to ask her, why did she believe you and not the overwhelming view of the intelligence community? So he said in there, but now then in the Washington Post before this, why do you suppose, and what is your, I guess your investigation revealing as to what the Washington Post is doing to try to either taint you or taint Tulsi and you?
Well, I don't take it personally because I think they were going after me because they were trying to go after Tulsi Gabbard. I think they're unprincipled. I want to take this opportunity to make it clear that Mr. Stanley Becker is an unprincipled journalist, and if there was any standards in journalism, he would never be hired again to write an important piece. His editor, this guy Ben Pauker, was equally unprincipled, because if you know anything about journalism, and I do know something about it because I've worked with journalism many years, the job of the editor is to make sure that the sources are credible that the journalist is using. And the editor, in this case, the immediate supervisor, Ben Pauker, did not do his job. In fact, he did the opposite. Now, it's clear from what happened and the circumstances that both of these people were working for the top leadership in the Washington Post, because the people at the top of the Washington Post would never put an article that's such a sham on the center front page, top of the fold location. This is the perfect location. This is what you do with your lead article on a subject, for that day. So this was from the top of the Washington Post leadership. No question.
You told me you have emails back and forth prior to the publication where you were trying to get them to, I guess, to understand what was going on and offer to give any additional information. Is that correct?
Not only did I offer to give them, I gave them information. They ignored it. The information that I just provided so far here was provided to them. Everything I showed you here was in their hands.
And what did they respond to you when you sent that?
What this guy Stanley Becker would keep telling me, he says, "I'm writing about Tulsi Gabbard," and I kept writing back to him. I said, "How can you write about, if you're writing about her capability, isn't the issue whether she understood the intelligence, that she had the initiative, unlike her colleagues in the Senate Intelligence Committee, who took no effort to understand what was being said, including, unfortunately, Senator Kelly, she took the effort to understand what was going on. Any good soldier, you can tell me I'm wrong, Mr. Soldier. Any good soldier always questions intelligence, no matter how reliable they think it might be. You never know.
It has to match up with what you see on the ground, because the intelligence can always be wrong, because it's the best understanding we have. So yes, you're supposed to question it, as opposed to what it sounded like Senator Kelly was suggesting, that she should have just blanket accepted whatever they said at face value and not even questioned anything, which is the exact opposite of what the DNI is supposed to do. So in that regard,
even if you have the intelligence and what you have looks relatively reliable, you should always ask the question, what might be missing here that changes this picture? Are the Russians pulling back because they've been defeated, or they're laying a trap for me to rush into so that they can then catch me in the crossfire? All of this stuff is very complicated, requires a great deal of knowledge, a great deal of guesswork, well-informed, intelligent guesswork. None of this was displayed by anybody.
Challenging assumptions as well.
Challenging and questioning the assumptions. And none of this was displayed by anybody on the Intelligence Committee, by anybody. And disappointingly, by Senator Kelly, because, again, he has a military background. He has a technical background. It's disappointing that this is the best we could get out of the senator.
So in the last few minutes we have here, just using your best guesses and your best assessment, what is this whole, I guess, situation tell you about the actual qualifications of Tulsi Gabbard to be the DNI. Is she qualified, or are they right in that there's some real questions?
Tulsi Gabbard is tremendously qualified to do this. She shows tremendous intelligence. Her instincts are superb. You know, when I would brief her, and I briefed her numerous times, she would pose questions to me that were right on the mark. Sometimes I could answer them, and sometimes I could tell her we just don't know. But she knew what to ask, and she knew what was important. So she showed tremendous skill and insight in her handling of the briefing that was provided to her. I also might add, from a point of view of an analyst, she was incredibly respectful of me as an individual and of me as a professional, both two levels, because I can tell you from my own personal experience working in the Pentagon, I was enormously respected as an analyst. I was in a lot of situations where everybody in the room was a 3- and 4-star admiral. And let me tell you, I was not respected as a person in those rooms, but I was respected as an analyst. And she always respected me as a person, as a human being. And to me, that says a boatload about her leadership capability. Because
Now,
a leader, I'm sorry.
I may be asking you something beyond your technical expertise, but just give me your best personal opinion, because one of the other things that I have noticed outside of these specific issues here about the 2013 sarin gas issue is that I see over and over in the media, not just in the New York Times or Washington Post, but just across the board, especially the major media, they keep reporting that there are those in the intelligence community, especially those in the Senate, that are going to have to make the vote on this. They keep saying that she's been very unimpressive, that she didn't seem to understand how things went together. Why do you suppose they would be saying those kind of things in light of what you just said?
Well, if you don't know anything, somebody who actually knows what they're talking about seems unimpressive to you, I guess, because none of these people showed an inkling of knowing what they're talking about. And not only did they indicate that they had no idea what they were talking about, they indicated that they had no ability to ask the right questions. That not only did they not know what they were talking about, they did not even know how to go about investigating or asking the right questions to get a better informed understanding. So it's like, it's like someone telling me I don't know what I'm talking about because they've been debating about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And, I've got nothing to say about that. So I clearly, I'm ignorant, because we all know that the issue is how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
I guess we can't really answer that one. So I appreciate your honesty in admitting those kinds of things.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm going to be contacting Senator Kelly. I hope he sees this. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I'm being direct. And I will be very happy to meet with him and have a frank discussion with him as equals. Because I am a technical analyst.
It would be great.
I was a tenured full professor at MIT. I provided the Chief of Naval Operations with critical intelligence that was critical to the security of this country. And I do not have innuendos made about me in public that were not properly vetted by the senator. That's for everyone.
Well, I would like to see that as well.
I look forward to meeting with him. I'm not angry or, we can just be professional about it, which has so far not occurred.
Well, and as we close here, there's one other thing that you do have some expertise on, which I hope we can get you back on the show really quick. President Trump has said that he wants to have an Iron Dome system for the United States, and I know we've had you on talking about the Israeli Iron Dome, and we want to have you back with some.
Let's hope it doesn't work like the Israeli Iron Dome, but anyway.
Well, right, but we want to talk about the feasibility and what's possible with that. So we're looking forward to having you back on real soon to actually give that kind of stuff, because that's something a lot of people want to know about. Yeah,
great. Thanks a lot.
You bet. Thank you. And thank you for joining us. Also this afternoon, we're going to be back at 2:00 the Eastern time to talk about Zelensky's new battle for getting a seat at the negotiating table, and what is the possibility of having a, quote, fair and just peace for the Ukrainian side. We'll discuss the pros and cons and new comments being made by Zelensky and a number of other players as well, to include President Trump. So we will see you at 2 o'clock on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.